Hey rehab team, the purpose of these videos is to go over the use of restraints with you. In this video we'll go over some definitions around restraints, when they're going to be used with patients, and different purposes of restraints. In addition to watching these videos, you'll also have to do a hands-on checkoff competency. I'll be conducting that with you guys in smaller groups. So to start off first, just to define a restraint, you'll find this definition in policy CP 52. So a restraint is any manual method, physical or mechanical device, material, or equipment that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a patient to move their hands or fingers, arms, legs, body, or head freely. So when a restraint is in use, there will have to be an order by a physician in place for the restraint to be used, and the nurse will also be the one that is in charge of doing checks on the patient. Standard restraints require a check by the nurse every hour, and if it's a locked cuff, it will require a check by the nurse every 15 minutes. So that's kind of the definition of a restraint, and the fact that an order needs to be in place for a restraint to be used. The use of restraint, what type of restraint or what device you'll use, should be defined by the intent of the device and not the device itself. So an example would be a locked cuff. Typically you'd think that that device would be used with a patient that is violent. However, those devices could be used with a patient, let's say, that continues to pull out their IV. They've tried maybe just the softer cuffs to keep them from being able to bend their arm and pull the IV, but the patient continues to be able to get out of that restraint and pull the IV. So they may actually use a locked restraint in that situation to keep the patient from being able to pull out the IV. Another important definition here around the restraint is the use of side rails on beds. So anytime that 4 side rails are up, it is considered a restraint on the patient because the patient is not able to get up freely out of bed. There are some exclusions to that, and that is a patient that's on a stretcher recovering from anesthesia. Both the side rails can be up. Any patient that's experiencing involuntary movements, like they're having seizures, the side rails could be up, but the side rails should also be padded so the patient can't fall between the bed and the side rail or injure themselves on the metal side rails. Anytime the therapeutic bed is used, that allows for movement, so those are those repositioning beds. That way when the patient is repositioned, they wouldn't fall out of bed. And side rails are also not considered a restraint with pediatric patients to actually protect them from rolling out of bed. If you do have the bed in a seated position with all 4 rails up, that is considered a restraint. However, if the bed is all 3 rails are up, but there's a food tray in front of the patient, that is not considered a restraint as long as the tray can be moved by the patient out of their way to be able to get up voluntarily. So that's kind of the definition around the use of side rails. Another important definition here is a physical hold. So physical hold is any manual method of holding the patient to restrict their freedom of movement during a crisis situation. So physical hold is only going to be used during a crisis situation in which the patient is not restrained, and it would be for the patient's safety or the staff's safety. And that would have to require documentation on why it was used, and it would also need an order from the physician. So. The other definition that's important here is seclusion. So a seclusion is the involuntary confinement of a patient alone in a room or an area from which a patient is physically prevented from leaving. Seclusion may only be used for the management of violent or self-destructive behavior. So violent or self-destructive behavior is any behavior that would jeopardize the immediate safety of a patient or a staff member or of others around them. So that is the definition of seclusion. So those are our definition. In the next video, we'll go over some typical emergencies that you might run into and what you'll need to do if a patient is restrained. And then we'll also go over what you do with a cuffed patient. and then go over, we'll have separate videos on each type of restraint device and how you will use it, and also how to apply a quick release.